Hey, morning, folks. Well, it may not be morning when you read or when you watch this, but anyway, I decided that I would do a quick 15-minute introduction to Romeo and Juliet, or as quickly as I can. So this will be the quick version, um, basically a narrated slideshow with my little webcam in the corner. So anyway, let's introduce Romeo and Juliet. So today we're going to talk about the play itself. We're going to give some tips and some hints about reading Shakespeare. And then if we've got some time, we'll give some history and some background. So we're going to go through this a little quickly. You may have to pause the video PowerPoint slideshow thing um, to take notes, but I'll let you know about that. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to start by talking about the building blocks, the features of a play, and like what makes a play different than an act, just any book. So top 10 features of the play. Most importantly, and this is what makes Shakespeare so difficult to do, particularly for distance learning or online, is that it's meant to be performed, not just read. Um, and number one, well, that's number one. Number two is that there's meant to be an audience and that people, i.e., the players, are meant to kind of interact with that audience and kind of play off of the audience's emotion and adjust in real time. Um, Number three is characters. Number four is dialogue. And number five is stage directions. Shakespeare doesn't use many stage directions. In fact, he uses almost no stage directions because what we're supposed to do is infer the directions from the dialogue, which will make sense as we go. I'll point some of that out as best I can through distance learning as we go along. Number six is setting. Seven is plot. 8 is theme, 9 is symbols. There is a bunch of symbolism in Shakespeare, particularly, not all plays. And then number 10, dramatic irony. Romeo and Juliet is all about dramatic irony. Dramatic irony is everywhere in it. If you don't remember what dramatic irony is, that is when the audience or a character knows something that other characters do not. All right. So oftentimes, whenever we mention Shakespeare, students are always going to complain about how it's difficult to read and understand, and I totally agree with that. So we're going to talk about three things that will hopefully, not hopefully, I guarantee will make reading Shakespeare easier. So, um, a pet peeve, and this will be great because now anytime you go out and talk with your fancy friends at your fancy parties or whatever, you'll be able to tell them that this is wrong. The number one problem of Shakespeare is the words because people always say that Shakespeare writes in Old English, and this just isn't true. In fact, Old English is closer, more closely related to, or sounds more like, or looks more like, I guess, German. And it's the language of the Anglo-Saxons. Middle English is blended with French, and then modern English is considered to begin around the time Shakespeare was actually writing. So Shakespeare actually technically writes in modern English because we can usually understand him. Like if we were dropped in a time machine, if we found a time machine and decided for whatever reason to go back to the 1600s, we'd be able to figure it out. That's probably not true definitely not true with Old English, and it would be much harder with Middle English. But in case you still don't believe me, this is actually what Old English looks like. And this is Middle English. I believe, I thought this was from Chaucer, but as you can tell, if you read this, you can probably figure it out. I had to read some of this stuff when I was in college because I was an English major and I focused on British literature because I didn't know any better. But you can kind of figure out what is being said in here. So, in all actuality, Shakespeare's English is about 90% the same as our own, and figuring out the other 10% is actually pretty easy when you get the tips that I'm going to give you. So one of the big things that we need to look at is paying attention to pronouns. In case you can't remember, pronouns are the he, they, him, she. They take place of a noun. So these can often help signal the relationship between characters, and they are critical in determining how a scene should be read. Make sure you copy these down, but this tells you what the pronouns, most of the time Shakespeare will be using informal pronouns because equals may be talking to each other. So thou and thee, thy and thine, ye and I. Now, verb endings do not change in English anymore. But when Shakespeare was writing, they did. So if you have thou, right, which is an informal version of you, right, like you as in the audience, the person reading, thou plus a verb ends in T, ST, or EST, depending on the verb. So thou shalt, thou canst. Now, if you have a he, she pronoun in a verb, it ends in F. She knoweth, he wanteth. There are also contractions in Shakespeare. So copy these down, make sure you are relatively familiar with them. Now, why would somebody want to put contractions in Shakespeare? It has to do with the syllable count. And so the syllables are why they would do it. So for words that you do not recognize, try using the context or footnotes or a glossary to help you figure them out. Also remember that words can change meaning often, and it has been 450 years since this play was written. So in that time, words have definitely changed meaning. So keep that in mind as you go along. Problem number 2 is syntax. So all the plays during the Renaissance were written in poetry. So Shakespeare is writing in a poetic style. And most plays from the Renaissance were written in what is called blank verse, unrhymed iambic pentameter. See, there you go. So copy these two things down. This says of in case my webcam is in the way. But blank verse is unrhymed lines of iambic pentameter. Now maybe you're sitting there going, well, that's great, Maurer, but what is iambic pentameter? Iambic pentameter is a rhythm pattern in poetry. Each line has 5 pairs of an unstressed syllable followed by a stressed syllable. It sounds something like da-dum, 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 da-dum. Now you won't be able to unhear it, right? But if you have something like, but soft what light through yonder window breaks, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Right? So it has this kind of beat to it. So that's why Shakespeare's plays are such a big deal, because he wrote a ton of these and they all follow this pattern. 95% of the time. Now, something else we need to pay attention to is a heroic couplet. A heroic couplet is 2 lines of iambic, that's what that says right there. You're going to want to copy this down. 2 lines of iambic pentameter that rhyme, often used to signal the end of a scene with dramatic finality. The plays The Thing, wherein I'll catch the conscience of the king. This is more relevant in any of Shakespeare's sonnets. He usually ends his sonnets with a rhyming, not usually, does end his sonnets with a rhyming couplet, and often he will end a scene or an act with a sonnet. You'll see. So be sure to pay attention to when Shakespeare doesn't use iambic pentameter and instead writes in prose. It does happen. Often it can signal a character's social class or psychological state. Usually, if they're poor, they don't speak in iambic pentameter or blank verse, because Shakespeare was kind of a jerk. So, hints for syntax. If you aren't sure about a sentence's meaning in Shakespeare, it is likely that the word order has been changed or that certain words have been left out or abbreviated to fit a particular rhythmic pattern. Remember what we said earlier, Shakespeare wrote in iambic pentameter, meaning he needed to follow certain patterns, and therefore he would mess with sentences in word order. All right, we're going to finish up this step number 3, and then we'll probably be done with the video for today because we're running out of time. So, whenever we're talking about figurative language, remember figurative language is a symbolism, uh, metaphor, simile, all that stuff. So, hint when we're using the formalist lens, consider the effect of common language devices like simile, metaphor, personification, and allusion. All of these pop up in Shakespeare. Allusions pop up a lot. Remember, those are a reference to a well-known piece of art or media. So these are examples. That first one says, so if the language is difficult at times, why don't we just translate it? Um, and yeah, and this is me kind of getting on my soapbox a little bit. So sure, we could translate it, and in fact, the version that you'll be reading is translated, but we kind of lose something with the translation. Um, it just doesn't sound the same, doesn't sound as pretty. It's kind of like listening to your favorite song without music. So this is a famous sonnet. It's called Sonnet 18. Uh, if we had a usual class, we would practice our Shakespeare by going through this line by line, and you would translate it. I would also flex on you and show you that I know how to say it because I've got it memorized, because I had a teacher in high school who made us. But we're going to skip that now. And we'll end with my words of wisdom, and I'll be on my soapbox here. So sometimes, in order to become appreciative of work, uh, we have to dig a little deeper. So a good example of this is basically just want you to challenge you to listen to it sometimes. Find a recording on YouTube. They're all over. When you watch the videos, just relax and listen to the Shakespearean language. Try to find the beauty in the words. A good example of this is in college. In my senior year in college, I was taking an American Lit class, and we read The Great Gatsby, and I hate it. I hate The Great Gatsby. It's just a bunch of rich people sitting around complaining about being rich and bored, and I just can't. I can't. But my professor loved it, and one day I challenged him and said, like, this is trash. And he said, well, the story isn't necessarily great, but it's the language that makes the story great. So think about how pretty the words are. And then he quoted the book because that's what teachers always do when, you know, they're challenged. They just quote books all the time. So, uh, anyway, sorry that that last bit was a bit rushed, but we're going to end there for now. Make sure that you've got some notes and have copied down some of the key vocabulary, and check Google Classroom for anything else that may be coming up. As always, email me if you got questions or send me a message, but have a good rest of your day, and you'll hear from me soon.